Bill, I want to ask you about how the Republican Party, specifically Republicans on Capitol Hill, are going to process this. Let me just first show folks what has played out in the last couple of hours, though. Mitt Romney, Trump critic certainly from the 2016 campaign, now a senator from Utah. He was asked about it earlier tonight. Here's what he had to say.
I think it'd be very helpful to get to the bottom of the facts, to follow the law that get us there. That would include the whistleblower as well as the transcript of the conversation.
And if they don't?
Well, that'll be up to the House to decide how to proceed. But it's very much, I believe, in the public interest to get this resolved and be able to move on.
So there is Mitt Romney, a former Republican nominee, obviously calling for that whistleblower complaint to be made available, also potentially the transcript of the conversation. I should note, Romney made those comments. Trump, through his Twitter feed, then went after Romney, basically video of him losing the election in 2012, basically, calling him a loser through his tweet there. Bill, are you going to see more Republicans doing and saying what Mitt Romney said tonight, or is he going to be an exception here?
I don't know, but I think it's more likely than it has been at any point so far that others will follow. I think Mitt Romney's played an important role in this. His tweet on Sunday, I think it was, kind of earlier Sunday, I think was an important moment. He said, we need to get the facts. First, it's a very serious matter, very troubling. He put it in Romney-esque terms, so it wasn't quite as dramatic as some people liked, but very troubling in the extreme, and we need to get the facts. Once you say we need to get the facts, then you're saying the administration has to turn over the transcript and the whistleblower report and make witnesses available and so forth. And you're implying that if the administration doesn't do that, then Congress has been thwarted and presumably would have to consider that obstruction perhaps itself impeachable. I mean, one of the big things, Maya is absolutely right, that one reason this is so important is it's Trump as president doing this directly from the Oval Office to the president of another nation. Pretty different from his son meeting in a shady meeting in the Trump Tower in the middle of a chaotic campaign in 2016. Ironically, another difference now is there's no Mueller investigation. I mean, if this had happened a year ago, someone would have said, House Democrats looking to avoid having to bite the bullet, would have said, let's let Robert Mueller look into it. He's looking into everything else, and then we'll look at the report and make a decision. No, there's no Mueller. The Justice Department's not looking at it. It's not going to get to court anytime soon. And so it's in Congress's lap. And Congress is fairly squaced, squarely faced, I can't even speak, squarely faced now with the choice. I mean, are they going to let Trump get away with not only doing this pretty terrible thing, honestly, for a president to do, apparently, if that's what he did, but also to simply stonewall Congress? I mean, the ball really is in the House's court. So I think Rosa DeLauro is very significant. I saw her, as it happens, last week with Nancy Pelosi at an event. They're very close. They didn't tell me anything, top secret, but I got the impression from both of them that they were, they sort of joked to me about how I was, more for impeachment than they were, that they were sort of opening their minds a little more. But I think this statement by DeLauro is very important. That signals to me, I think, where Nancy Pelosi is going. I think Romney has helped reassure maybe Speaker Pelosi that there is the possibility of Republican support, maybe in the House, and incidentally, maybe in the Senate. If you take Romney's statement seriously, he's not just saying that maybe the House should impeach. He's sort of saying that maybe, as a Senate Republican, he would vote to convict. And suddenly, if you have a couple more Republicans even sound somewhat like that, the notion that this is a purely partisan maneuver, there'll be no Republican in the Senate who will even take it seriously, that goes away. One final thing, I'm sorry I'm going on so long, is I think the House Republicans who've served in the military or in the intelligence community, those 7 Democratic freshmen put out that op-ed earlier this evening that's very powerful, I think. I've got to think that Will Hurd, Mike Gallagher, Mike Fitzpatrick, Will Hurd, CIA, Gallagher, Army, and Fitzpatrick, FBI, former in each of those cases, they've all shown streaks of independence from Trump at a moment. I've got to think they're thinking to themselves, maybe this is the moment for me to step up as well.
Well, so Maya, let's pick up on what Bill just said there, because he raises if Democrats unanimously in the House decided they wanted to impeach the president, they would have the votes to do so. However, they would not have the votes to convict him in the Senate. You need the 2/3 supermajority. You need Republican buy-in. If Democrats are making a decision to go forward with impeachment, given those political realities, is there a case there to narrow the scope of this? You've already got the Judiciary Committee pursuing some kind of impeachment inquiry. We're not quite sure what's going on there, talking about a lot of matters in the Mueller report, some other things that have come up. Is there a case strategically here for Democrats to say, no, if we go forward, it's about this Ukraine business. Make it narrow and focused on that.
I think there is a case, certainly. I think one of the things that the Democrats have to be somewhat concerned with is if they have substantial evidence from the Mueller report that Donald Trump, as a sitting president, took steps to apparently obstruct justice, literally took steps to make sure that the Mueller investigation was interfered with as a sitting president, what might he do here? And they probably have to do some work to remind the American public that their oversight has to protect against that in this case as well. So I think there are a couple of things happening here. One, they still don't know until they have a proceeding whether or not they're going to win. Republicans, as we've heard Mitt Romney make very clear, he's got to see more. Fair. That is fair. But this is also about the American public and what they think after they hear it. And what Democrats have to do, I think, is make sure they have a coherent story that people can follow simply. And the more you confuse things with 6 years of information, the harder it is for the average citizen to follow. But you can't just limit it from this pattern of behavior that may very well arise while they are trying to do any kind of investigation of what we're hearing about this whistleblower.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.